Okay, today we're going to talk about psychopharmacology. We're going to talk about neurotransmitters, the drugs, and how it changes your behavior. And maybe there we go. Okay, there we go. Most drugs affect the brain and behavior by changing synaptic transmissions. So we're going to talk about how these drugs actually affect the neurons that we're referring to. Axons release a chemical that either excites or inhibits the attached neuron. This is called a neurotransmitter or merely a transmitter. The first transmitters to be discovered were the amine transmitters in the 1940s. The three amines are catecholamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Epinephrine, another name for epinephrine and norepinephrine, are noradrenaline and adrenaline. In the 1950s, the amino acid transmitters were discovered, glutamate, glycine, and gamma-aminobutyric acid, also known as GABA. In the 1970s, investigators recognized the short chains of amino acids called peptides also served as transmitters. These were the endogenous opioids. Endogenous means from the inside. Oxytocin, substance P, and vasopressin. Endogenous opioids, of course, block pain, as does substance P tells you when you're in pain. Oxytocin is a neurotransmitter that tells you to take care of your kids, is what it does. It also allows the female mammary gland to produce milk, and vasopressin allows you to urinate. It collects urine in your kidneys, from your kidneys. Transmitters must meet the following criteria. The chemical exists in the presynaptic terminal. The transmitter is manufactured in the neuron. The transmitter is released when the neuron fires. Specific receptors exist to receive the transmitter. Adequate amounts of the transmitter will make the neuron fire. And if we block the transmitter, it stops whatever activity we're talking about. So let's talk about a transmitter, serotonin. It does exist in the presynaptic terminal. It is manufactured in the neuron. It is released when the neuron fires, serotonin. Specific receptors exist to receive the transmitter, and that's what makes you more relaxed and happier. Adequate amounts of the transmitter will make the neuron fire, of course, and if we block it, it stops the activity. So if we block serotonin, then you won't be nearly as happy as you were before. There are two types of receptors, ionotropic or ion-directed. It responds immediately and allows ions to pass through the receptor when the transmitter is present. That is the rapid one, and the slow one is metabotropic. It responds slowly by accumulating G proteins to activate other ion channels or other changes in the cells. And now we're going to look at what this looks like. We're going to see why the metabotropic or the metabotropic reactions are so slow. And here we go. And here we go.
When a ligand binds to the receptor site on the outside of the cell membrane, the G protein changes conformation, and guanosine triphosphate replaces the guanosine diphosphate on the alpha subunit of the G protein. The activated alpha subunit then separates from the beta and gamma subunits. The alpha subunit, with guanosine triphosphate attached, binds to the calcium ion channel, causing the calcium ion channel to open. Calcium ions diffuse into the cell and combine with calmodulin. The combination of calmodulin and calcium produces the response of the cell to the ligand. Phosphorylase activity removes a phosphate from the guanosine triphosphate, leaving guanosine diphosphate bound to the alpha subunit. The inactivated alpha subunit separates from the calcium ion channel, and the channel closes. The alpha subunit recombines with the gamma and beta subunits, and the G protein recombines with the receptor.
Right. So you can see how slow that is. Although that whole chemical process has to take place with an ionotropic reaction, it just passes right through. The transmitter just passes through the cell membrane. Acetylcholine was the first transmitter discovered. Acetylcholine is contained in the cholinergic nerve cells. There's a lot of acetylcholine. Okay, it does a lot of different things. Nucleus basalis and the medial septal nucleus in the basal forebrain are cholinergic cells that project to the hippocampus and the amygdala to promote memory. And this is the area, and I don't have an arrow. I'm sorry. Whoops. Looking for my arrow. Cells in this area are often destroyed in Alzheimer's disease, and of course that allows memory not to take place. Actually, acetylcholine, the drugs atropine used to dilate your eyes, and scopolamine, which is a truth serum, are both acetylcholine antagonists. It blocks the action of the transmitter, scopolamine and atropine. And because of that, you remember things, scopolamine, because there's too much acetylcholine in your receptors, and you can't tell a lie. The pedunculopontine nucleus and the lateral-dorsal tegmental nucleus control sleep and are cholinergic cells. There are two main types of acetylcholine receptors, nicotinic and muscarinic, and that's what we were talking about in the last chapter. Nicotinic receptors are ionotropic and have excitatory functions. The muscarinic receptors are metabotropic and can be excitatory or inhibitory. And as we know, the muscarinic, the metabotropic reactions are much slower than the ionotropic. So this is one of the reasons why nicotine works so rapidly in your system, why you get a almost immediate dopamine spike. It's because it is ionotropic. There are 5 transmitters classified as monoamines in 2 groups. The catecholamines are norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine, and the indolamines are serotonin and melatonin. Dopamine is one of the most abundant transmitters. It is found all over the brain, but 2 of the more important areas are in the mesostriatal system and the mesolimbocortical system. The mesostriatal system includes the substantia nigra to the striatum caudate and the putamen. This area of the brain does not actually have very many nerve cells, so that nerves are there can control thousands of synapses. So, the degeneration of this system can result in Parkinson's disease. Of course, Parkinson's disease is where your hands, you have tremors in your hands, and it can cause paralysis, especially of your hands. And so this area is crucial to motor control. This can be caused by aging in select individuals. It can be caused by drug use. You can get Parkinsonian symptoms from using drugs, or frequent and prolonged head traumas can cause Parkinsonian symptoms. And of course, we see this with boxers. Boxers will sometimes have memory problems. Sometimes they will, like what happened with Muhammad Ali. Of course, he had Parkinson's, what they referred to as Parkinson's disease. When they took an MRI of his brain, what they discovered was the ventricles in his brain had enlarged and had taken over much of his brain, and that was part of what caused his Parkinson's disease. So it was all those blows to the head. People who have frequent TBIs, such as football players, can potentially develop these symptoms as well. And those are the areas that we were talking about. Oops, there's a substantia nigra. Mesolimbocortical system. This area is just in front of the mesostriatal area. This area projects into the limbic system, the amygdala, hippocampus, and nucleus accumbens. Overstimulation of this area and the dopamine pathways seem to cause schizophrenia. If it's overstimulated, if you have too many dopamine receptor sites, then the individual will have erratic behavior that is diagnosed as schizophrenia. There's 5 types of dopamine receptors that have been identified: the D1, D2, D3, D4, and D5. D1 and D5 react in similar manners, but are very different from the D2, D3, and D4. Antipsychotic drugs that bind the D2 receptor sites relieve the symptoms of schizophrenia. Norepinephrine is released from 3 different areas in the brainstem. The impact of the neurons producing norepinephrine expands broadly throughout the cerebrum, cerebellum, and spinal cord. This transmitter is believed to affect a broad range of behavioral and physiological functions. Serotonin is classified as an indolamine, a subclassification of monoamines. Large areas of the brain are controlled by serotonin-producing neurons. Few neurons actually release serotonin. The main group is an area of the brainstem called the raphe nuclei, and as you can see, it's down there below right across from the cerebellum. 15 types of serotonin receptors have been identified. Amino acids as transmitters. Some amino acids act as neurotransmitters. The excitatory amino acids are glutamate and aspartate. Glutamate is the most common excitatory transmitter. The inhibitory amino acids are gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, and glycine. GABA is the most common inhibitory transmitter. Glutamate uses both ionotropic and receptors and metabotropic receptors. The ionotropic receptors are AMPA receptors. AMPA receptors are able to increase with learning, accelerating, and processing function. Kainate receptors are also ionotropic receptors, as are NMDA receptors, which is a good thing because NMDA is involved in information processing. Glutamate has a feature known as excitotoxicity, whereby a neuron that is depolarized due to injury or stroke will die. Glutamate is cleared by astrocytes. The glial cells clear the glutamate. GABA receptors can be divided into 3 types, A, B, and C. GABA-A receptors contain chloride channels and are ionotropic. GABA-B receptors are metabotropic. GABC receptors are ionotropic with chloride channels, but they have a different function than GABA receptors. Drugs that block the actions of GABA can cause seizures, and this is one of the things that physicians have to be very careful of. The peptides, immunopeptides, have a prominent role in the brain as neurotransmitters. Opioid peptides are endorphins, the enkephalins, and dynorphin. Substance P, cholecystokinin, neurotensin, neuropeptide Y, these are all found in the gut and the spinal cord. Cholecystokinin, of course, has to do with your gallbladder. Pituitary hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin. Neurotransmitters work on just select receptor sites that contain a receptor for that select neurotransmitter, like a lock and key. Most neurotransmitters work on more than one receptor. For example, acetylcholine in the muscles excites muscular activity, while in the vagal nerve it inhibits functioning of the heart and the digestive tract. The neurotransmitters in the body are known as endogenous ligands. Endogenous means internal, and ligands, of course, has to do with transmitters. Man-made drugs or exogenous ligands work because they either act as a neurotransmitter and excite or inhibit the neuron, or they block the action of the transmitter and keep it from affecting the neuron. Some drug molecules bind to the receptor molecule for a long time, while others only for a short time. A drug with a high affinity for a receptor will stay with the receptor longer, so less is needed to be effective. A drug with low affinity for a receptor will require a higher concentration of the drug to be effective. If both a high and low affinity drug is present, the drug with the high affinity will interfere with the low affinity drug. And this is one of the reasons why it's very important for doctors to know exactly what you're taking. Even if you're taking illicit drugs, you need to tell your doctor. If you're taking any supplements, some supplements actually have medical uses, and they will block medications. So it's very important that you tell your doctor everything that you're taking, including the supplements. I take a whole pile of supplements every day. DHEA, L-carnitine, ginkgo biloba, ginseng. What else do I take? I take multivitamin. And it's possible that those could interfere with some of my medications, but they don't. So every time I go in to see the doctor, I always tell him all the drugs that I'm taking, all the medications, all the supplements that I'm taking. Agonists do the same job as the transmitter, and the antagonists block the job of the transmitter. Agonists do the same job as the transmitter, and antagonists block the job of the transmitter. Some drugs bind with the receptor and make the receptor do the opposite of what they were intended to do. For example, inhibit to excite or excite to inhibit. These drugs are called inverse agonists. Some drugs bind to the receptor in a place that does not bind to the transmitter. When the transmitter binds to the receptor, the drug does not allow the transmitter to activate the neuron. Since the drug does not bind in the transmitter receptor site, it is called a non-competitive antagonist. Drugs that act in a similar manner but activate the neuron are known as non-competitive agonists. The drug Respirine, which acts as a sedative and as an antihypertensive, inhibits the storage of catecholamine transmitters, dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, which tend to excite things in the vesicles. And since they excite things, since adrenaline increases your blood pressure, norepinephrine increases your heart rate and increases your blood pressure, as does dopamine. Because it blocks the concentration of these, the storage of these, it lowers your blood pressure. Colchicine, an anti-inflammatory and painkiller used on gout, works because it blocks the maintenance of the microtubules and the axonal transport. Caffeine competes with the inhibitor adenosine, thus preventing the inhibitory effect. And because adenosine slows you down, makes you tired, caffeine does exactly the opposite because it blocks the inhibitory process of adenosine. So caffeine, by blocking adenosine, doesn't make you tired. It actually excites you, and it raises your blood pressure. Calcium channel blockers, verapamil for high blood pressure, block the calcium channel and thus won't allow the activation of the neuron to release the synaptic vesicles. Amphetamines are calcium channel blockers that inhibit the inhibitory neurons that control the release of catecholamines, especially adrenaline, making an individual feel excited and full of energy. Black widow venom causes the over-release of acetylcholine, and eventually the individual goes into seizures. Cocaine and amphetamines inhibit reuptake mechanisms, prolonging synaptic activity. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors prolong the synaptic activity of serotonin, which in turn combats depression. This is also how it decreases the sex drive, which is regulated by testosterone in the hypothalamus and controlled by serotonin. And since it's releasing more serotonin into your synaptic clefts, it is blocking more of your testosterone. Testosterone creates your sex drive. And so for some individuals, especially older individuals whose testosterone is not as high, this individual may lack a sex drive because of the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And of course, when your doctor gives you an antidepressant like an SSRI, one of the things they need to tell you is that this may inhibit your sex drive uh, and may not make you want to have sex anymore. Alcohol increases the number of receptors for the inhibitory transmitter GABA. Antipsychotic drugs block dopamine receptor sites. Curare blocks nicotinic acetylcholine receptor sites. Physostigmine is a drug given to Alzheimer's patients to increase memory. It works because it inhibits acetylcholinesterase, the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine in the synaptic cleft. This allows acetylcholine to stay in the synapse longer, and since acetylcholine activates memory, it leads to an improved memory. Opiates are analgesics. Analgesics are painkillers. That's what analgesic means. Opiate receptors are found in the limbic and hypothalamic areas of the brain as well as in the gray matter of the brainstem. Synthetic opiates such as Demerol can be injected directly into the spinal cord to cause pain blockage, and that's what a spinal block is. It's when they inject Demerol directly into your spinal column, blocking all pain from your waist down or from wherever they inject the Demerol. Endorphins are endogenous opiates. They're internal opiates. Endorphins are released with physical activity or select physical manipulation, such as massage, bathing, or breastfeeding. As odd as that seems, a bath doesn't. I'm not sensitive to opiates, and it may be because I don't have very many endorphins in my system. So when I take a bath, it doesn't really release anything. Massages don't do anything for me, and of course, I don't breastfeed. My goodness, that would be odd. Endorphins tend to not only block pain, but energize as well. Marijuana is the most widely used illegal and legal drug in the United States. The main active ingredient in marijuana is tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. The human brain actually maintains receptor sites that turn out to be cannabinoid receptors. For a long time, no endogenous ligands could be discovered that shared the cannabinoid receptors, but now we have discovered anandamide, which triggers memory and hunger. Anandamide triggers memory, and it tells you when you have had enough. Since marijuana takes up that receptor site, it disrupts your memory and it makes you feel hunger. That's what the munchies are all about. THC receptors are found in the hippocampus, cerebellum, the substantia nigra, and the cerebral cortex. The receptors reduce sensitivity to pain, reduces sensitivity to temperature, it reduces movement, and it reduces response to external stimuli. And of course, if you've ever been around somebody who smoked marijuana, you know that they were less sensitive to pain. They had a difficult time with their regulating their temperature. They kind of sat there and didn't move a whole lot, and of course, they weren't aware of what was going on around them. Things would happen. One time. One time I was playing in a softball tournament. It was a co-ed tournament, and it was an all-night, it was a 24-hour thing. It was really kind of silly. Anyway, so it wasn't my team, but the other team went out and smoked pot in between games, and which was the dumbest thing in the world because when we started playing softball, it was like 2 o'clock in the morning. These people were stoned out of their heads, and I tell you, it was dangerous because here they couldn't pitch. I mean, everything was a ball. It was just terrible. And if the ball came to them, I mean, sometimes they would stick their glove out after the ball was past them and hit them in the face. I mean, it was really dangerous. Eventually, they just forfeited the game because they were fairly non-functional, not functional enough to play very well. Alcohol works on the nervous system in two ways. Initially, it acts as a stimulant. And this isn't funny. This girl got hit in the face and her nose started bleeding. And, you would have thought, ouch. But she didn't even react to it. She just and blood's pouring down, and I think it broke her nose. It looked pretty messed up anyway. But she didn't react to it at all. She didn't feel any pain. I guess that's a good thing. I'm sure she felt pain the next day. Alcohol works on the nervous system in two ways. Initially, it acts as a stimulant. Increased use produces a longer depressant phase. Prolonged use of alcohol can damage nerve cells. Areas affected by long-term use include the Purkinje cells of the cerebellum, which has to do with movement, the superior frontal cortex, and that's the part that has to do with reason, and hippocampal pyramidal cells, that has to do with memory. So the more you drink, the more you bother your movement, your reasoning capacity, and your memory. That sounds like a fun triad, doesn't it? Drinker versus a non-drinker. As you can see, there's a lot of, well, we're going to talk about this in just a second. Alcohol activates the GABA receptors, increasing postsynaptic inhibition. Euphoria when drinking may be stimulated by dopamine activation. It activates excitatory glutamate receptors while it reduces the effect of glutamate and interferes with second messenger systems inside the neurons. Which has to do, okay. So what we have here is a drinker, and of course the back part of the brain, the bottom part is the back, the front is on top. We're getting excitotoxicity in the cerebellum area, and that is it. Anxiolytics, anxiety loosening, are medications that treat anxiety. About 8% of American adults suffer from anxiety. The major anxiolytics now in use are benzodiazepines, with the most popular being alprazolam, also known as Xanax, and diazepam, also known as Valium. Benzodiazepines work by enhancing GABA receptors, increasing the effect. Benzodiazepines mirror the reduction of stress produced by allopregnanolone, a hormone derived from progesterone. Allopregnanolone binds to GABA receptors, increasing the effectiveness of GABA. GABA in turn inhibits the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone, which triggers the stress response. Alcohol increases the level of allopregnanolone in the brain, creating the calming effect of alcohol, and that's why it works that way. Stimulants are drugs that lead the brain to states of more excitation than inhibition. They have an alerting and activating effect. Some act by stimulating excitatory neurotransmitters. Some act by blocking normal inhibitory processes, as caffeine does with adenosine. Nicotine, until the advent of milder cigarettes, nicotine was not widely used. It was too harsh. It burned people's mouths. It bothered their mucous membranes. So they really didn't use it very much. We're talking about pipe tobacco, and we're talking about cigars. Because of the mildness of cigarette smoke, it is more readily drawn into the lungs and thus is able to cover a large surface of the lungs. The harsher forms of tobacco tend to only come in contact with the mucous membrane. You can only take it into your mouth. You really can't take it down into your lungs. It's too harsh. And because of that, of course, people who smoke cigars and people who smoke pipes tend not to have the same lung cancer that individuals who smoke cigarettes have. However, if you smoke a pipe, smoke a cigar, these individuals tend to have more mouth and esophageal cancer. And the reason is because they hold the tobacco in that area of their bodies, and then they blow it out. And since they are irritating the mucous membranes more, they tend to have esophageal and cancer of the mouth. Freud was a big-time cigar smoker, and Freud, of course, lost half of his jaw to cancer. And of course, he had a prosthesis that he put in. He hated the prosthesis. It was very painful for him, but it's his own damn fault for smoking cigars. And of course, if you see a lot of pictures of Freud, he is smoking a cigar. So there you go. He paid the price. Nicotine activates the acetylcholine receptors known as nicotinic receptors. These receptors are found primarily in the neuromuscular junctions and in the neurons of the autonomic ganglia. Nicotine works on the body by increasing the heart rate, by stimulating the sympathetic nervous system, and by stimulating the release of epinephrine. Now, one of the interesting things about tobacco, nicotine, is that it actually helps your memory, as weird as that is. And that's because of the epinephrine. And it's also because of the acetylcholine. So it's easier, people that smoke have better memories, as weird as that sounds. Cocaine is synthesized from the coca shrub. In their natural and more diluted form, the coca leaves do not produce either an extreme reaction or possibility of addiction. Increased endurance, lower sensitivity to hunger, and a vague sense of well-being. Those are that's what happens to you when you use cocaine. There we go. Synthesized into its concentrated powder or crystals, and that's the crack, of course. The effect is much stronger. As a powder, it is snorted through the nostrils for rapid lung diffusion and thus rapid entry into the bloodstream. Crack, when smoked, enters the bloodstream even faster than the cocaine does. Cocaine blocks norepinephrine receptors and allows more of the transmitter to circulate in the brain because cocaine is a vasoconstrictor. It increases the blood pressure and induces greater heart activity. This can lead to stroke of the newly initiated or the experienced user. As we see on the left, cocaine slows everything down. You think you're smarter, but you're not really. So you can see cocaine when you're not snorting cocaine, you get excitotoxicity, and so you have less activity in your brain unless you're actually using the cocaine. Oddly, cocaine leads to less activity in the frontal lobe, the seat of intellectual function. Even after stopping the use of cocaine, the brain does not return to normal metabolism for several months. Children exposed to cocaine in the womb may suffer from irreversible harm to the development of the brain. Cocaine seems to interfere with the ability to focus, attention, and with some intellectual functions. Amphetamines and methamphetamines have a similar structure to the catecholamine transmitters epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. The amphetamines cause the release of these transmitters from the synaptic vesicles without a nerve impulse. After the release of the transmitters, the amphetamines enhance the activity by blocking the reuptake of the endogenous transmitter, competing with endogenous transmitters for the enzyme that inactivates them. Thus, the amphetamine prolongs the presence of the endogenous transmitters in the synaptic cleft. So what's keeping in there? Epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. Okay. So epinephrine makes you excited, norepinephrine makes you feel like you can conquer the world, and dopamine makes you feel good. So when you take the amphetamines, all this stuff stays in your system a lot longer. Amphetamines, a short-term effect, it heightens your alertness to a state of euphoria. It wards off boredom. It promotes sustained effort with little rest and lowered fatigue. However, quality of work is not enhanced. That's one of the things you need to remember. It increases motivation, but it does not increase your cognitive ability. As a matter of fact, the more you take of it, the less likely that you're going to be smart. There you go. Amphetamines affect the autonomic nervous system by producing high blood pressure, produces tremors, dizziness, sweating, rapid breathing, and nausea. That's when you're taking it. Okay, so when you're not taking it, what happens? Well, remember this boredom that you didn't feel before? Now all of a sudden you feel bored. And as a matter of fact, you can't feel anything but boredom because you have one of the things that happens is when you take amphetamines, of course, you get an upregulation of your receptors. I'm sorry, you get a downregulation of your receptors, otherwise those neurons might perish. And since you have a downregulation when you are using it, of course, you get a one reaction. But since you've downregulated your neurons, now all of a sudden you have fewer of those receptor sites. So when you are not using, you feel bored, as weird as that may seem. The long-term effect of amphetamines, you develop a tolerance, progressive loss of effectiveness of the drug. This may be due to excitotoxicity, as we were saying before, the downregulation that is very common. Sleeplessness, you have difficulty sleeping. Severe weight loss because you are active all the time, including your brain. General deterioration of mental and physical condition. And of course, it just accelerates your life. Extreme use may lead to symptoms similar to those of paranoid schizophrenia, compulsive agitated behavior, irrational suspiciousness. Observation of those who use chronically show symptoms of brain damage. Hallucinogens alter sensory perception. The hallucinogens include LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin. The hallucinations are often visual in effect. LSD, or lysergic acid diethylmide, creates its amazing effect by acting on select serotonin receptors, but researchers are not sure exactly why. The structure of LSD resembles that of serotonin. PCP, or phencyclidine, was developed as an analgesic and an anesthesia, but it created such agitated side effects that its use on humans was stopped. Resurfacing as a veterinary anesthesia, as an anesthetic, its effects became known on the street, and abuse of the drug followed. PCP can become toxic fairly quickly, with low doses causing combativeness and catatonia, stupor, or mania. Usually it's mania. It rarely makes you feel stuporous. Rigidity and extreme to the point of extreme flexibility. Phencyclidine can be found in a powder form, dissolved in water as a pill or as a dark gummy substance. It is usually smoked by placing it on marijuana or on another leafy substance. PCP antagonizes the NMDA receptor and stimulates the release of the transmitter dopamine. Research shows that possibly PCP acts on the prefrontal cortex and produces transient psychosis. Research with animals also shows a degeneration of the hippocampus and the cingulate gyrus. Wow. So let's take a drug and become psychotic. One of the newest street hallucinogens is the European rave drug ecstasy, or MDMA. The drug is a combination of amphetamine and hallucinogen and affects the serotonin-producing neurons in the brain. MDMA, while it has a calming effect during use, it may actually be creating a state of excitotoxicity if used frequently. Animal studies have shown marked decreases in serotonin axons after use. This may affect mood and memory. Remember, this stuff excites your serotonin-producing cells, so you have more serotonin in your system. That's going to cause a downregulation of serotonin receptor sites. So guess what happens when you are no longer taking the MDMA? You have fewer serotonin receptor sites. Guess what happens next? You become depressed, of course. Addiction to nicotine, alcohol, and drugs injure the community by running up medical expenses and causing people to die prematurely. Substance abusers commit crimes and cause traffic accidents. The cost of helping addicts control their addiction and that of controlling drug trafficking is quite high. Babies born to women using addictive substances impairs brain growth and potentially makes them have ADHD or have an intellectual deficit. 20% of all deaths in the United States every year are related to smoking. 100,000 of these are due to lung cancer. People over the age of 55. This is really kind of interesting. I've been watching the obituaries for almost all my life for no reason whatsoever. I was really kind of curious as to why people were dying. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. My parents didn't smoke and my parents didn't drink. And here these guys were dying in their 50s. And I wanted to know why. And I also wanted to figure out how long I would live. So I watched the obituaries every day. When I was born, the life expectancy was in the 50s. And that's because so many people drank and smoked at that time. Almost half the population smoked. And of course, a lot of these people died in their 40s and 50s. And of course, I noted that. But of course, since then, smoking has become less popular. So a lot of these individuals died of lung cancer. They used to tell you what people died of in the obituaries. They don't anymore. I guess it bothers too many people to find out that somebody died of leukemia or whatever. People over the age of 55, smoking doubles the probability of dementia, especially Alzheimer's disease. So smoking, while people who go, "Oh, yeah, I can smoke if I want to. It's a free world, man." But of course, then by the time they're in their 50s, they are suffering from Alzheimer's disease. About 125,000 deaths a year are associated with alcohol, many resulting from accidents and drunk driving. 70,000 deaths a year are caused by illegal drugs. 8,000 more deaths are caused by drug-associated AIDS. And of course, how many people have died of the coronavirus? I think it's 187,000 today. Today's Friday. That's when I'm doing this lecture. So I think we're up to 187,000. By the end of the weekend, by the end of the Labor Day weekend, we will probably be over 190,000. Scientists have been looking for cures of addiction for centuries. Many times, the treatments have been far more destructive than the addictions themselves. For example, physicians in the 19th century used to give people who were addicted to alcohol laudanum. Laudanum is opium dissolved in alcohol, which sounds kind of stupid to me, but they did it anyway. Edgar Allan Poe was an alcoholic, and he was taking laudanum around the time that he died. He died in his 40s. They think he was murdered. Anyway, he died in Baltimore. Coca-Cola was used as an alcohol substitute until the cocaine in the beverage was changed to the less addictive caffeine. Since each drug has different effects on the nervous system, it is tricky creating a single model of addiction. But that hasn't stopped anyone from trying anyway. The moral model, this is the one that we had for a century or so, through the 19th century and into the 20th century. It is a more moralistic era. It represented a more moralistic era. People blame drug abuse on the lack of moral character of the abuser. This model was based on an individual's need to ask for divine intervention to throw off the addiction. The disease model, and this first reared its head in the early 20th century. Not responding to the moralists that pointed their fingers at the addiction sufferers, the disease model sees addiction as an affliction that the individual acquires and which requires treatment to cure. The disease model has a large number of adherents because it does not deal with guilt and weakness as the moral model did, but sees the addiction as a chronic problem or as a disease. The physical dependence model is based on the withdrawal symptoms that an individual may go through after they have used a select drug. Drugs of abuse usually produce pleasurable feelings. Withdrawal symptoms usually are the opposite effects of the effects produced when using the drug. For example, morphine is an analgesic. With intravenous use, it produces an orgasmic rush that leads to a state of serene, drowsy euphoria. Withdrawal symptoms include irritability, tremors, and an elevated heart rate. Goosebumps appear, and the individual goes through an episode of temperature maladjustments, sweats and chills, and of course, nausea is quite common. As the individual progresses through withdrawals, the physiological changes that have occurred because of the drug to compensate for the drug affect the individual. Withdrawal symptoms can be relieved by re-administering the drug. Within 15 to 20 minutes, the individual has returned to a state of euphoria instead of one of painful agitation. While some drugs have striking withdrawal symptoms, such as opiates, others do not. Cocaine and marijuana, for example, have little to no physical withdrawal symptoms. And of course, for the longest time, we thought that cocaine and marijuana were not addictive because of the withdrawal symptoms. The reason cocaine has little to no physical withdrawal symptoms is because it clears out of your system so rapidly. The reason marijuana has little to no physical withdrawal symptoms is because it takes such a long time for it to leave your system. So cocaine and marijuana, of course, one only lasts for 10 minutes. The other can last for weeks. You can have marijuana in your system for an extended length of time. And for that reason, of course, they have very few physical withdrawal symptoms. In these cases, especially with the cocaine, the individual becomes psychologically dependent on the drug. This psychological pull is just as strong as the physical need that may be experienced with other substances. Sorry, I was getting a drink. The positive reward model came from animal research. Since animals are known to consume addictive substances in nature, researchers sought to discover if an animal could learn to take drugs. Using a simple direct feedback system, they discovered that animals learn to induce effects very rapidly. Researchers found that animals would engage in self-inducement even at levels that did not produce addiction. A wide variety of addictive drugs release dopamine in the nucleus accumbens just as food does in a hungry animal. This dopamine originates in the area of the brain referred to as the ventral tegmental region of the midbrain. And there you go, right there in the midbrain. Ventral tegmental area, nucleus accumbens, you can see how far it has to go. This dopaminergic pathway from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens serves as a reward system for many experiences. The addictive powers of drugs may come through stimulation of this pathway. Using a dopamine agonist, it reduces the cravings for some drugs. Biological factors: males are more likely to abuse drugs than females. There may also be a genetic predisposition. An alcoholic biological parent makes it more likely that a child will be addictive as well. Personal characteristics: aggressiveness and a tendency to act out emotional states are characteristics of drug abusers. These are the way people act when they are children. Characteristics that negate abuse, school achievement, high educational goals, and religiousness. All of these negate the probability that somebody will abuse drugs. The family situation, factors related to drug abuse include divorce of parents and having an antisocial sibling. Strong ties to parents protects against drug abuse, and that's some positive things. Social and community factors, high prevalence of drug use in the community, especially by peer group, will make it more likely that the individual will use drugs. It is possible to stop on your own, cold turkey. 90% of ex-smokers and 50% of problem drinkers seem to have quit on their own. There are drugs for detoxification, drugs that will control the withdrawal symptoms. Agonists of drugs that produce common addiction states. Methadone is an alpha opiate receptor agonist that constrains the cravings for heroin. Antagonist to the addictive drugs. Naltrexone is an antagonist to the opiate receptor, blocking the effect of the drug. Actually blocks the dopamine in the dopamine reward pathway. Anti-craving medications, substances that affect the desire for the drug. Antidepressants have been used with alcohol withdrawals. Medication that blocks drug metabolism. Antabuse blocks the metabolism of alcohol, producing instead acetaldehyde, which causes vomiting. Acetaldehyde is very similar to formaldehyde. As a matter of fact, they smell an awful lot alike. And as you can imagine, if you've ever been around formaldehyde, it kind of makes you kind of makes you gag a little bit. You can imagine having all that acetaldehyde in your stomach. The next thing you know, you're vomiting. And there we go. That is the end of the lecture. The reason I put this in here is because when you smoke a cigarette, you tend to get dopamine spikes. The nicotine level goes up, and that causes a dopamine spike. But if you chew tobacco or dip snuff, of course, you get a constant because you've got the tobacco in your lip. And the reason I put this in here is because when I first put this lecture together, I was up north on a reservation in the Northern Plains. A lot of those guys were cowboys, and a lot of those guys chewed tobacco or dipped snuff. Actually, most of them chewed dipped snuff. They all had that round circle in their back pocket. Anyway, I was trying to show them that dipping snuff is not a very good idea. That it's more addictive than smoking cigarettes. Anyway, that's the end of the chapter, and that is the end of the lecture. So stay safe. We'll see you next week.